Good morning to Asia, good afternoon to the Pacific, and good evening to the US and Latin America. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the APRU Multi-Hazards webinar series, looking ahead to the second decade of recovery after GEJT. It consists of two sessions, and today is the first session that includes two speakers. The second session will be held on March 25th. This webinar is organized by the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, APRU, Multi-Hazards Program, and the International Research Institute of Disaster Science, Tohoku University in Japan. I'm Takako Izumi, Associate Professor of Tohoku University and Program Director of the Multi-Hazard Program. It has been 11 years since the Great East Japan Earthquake and Tsunami that happened on March 11th, 2011. It claimed nearly 20,000 fatalities. The recovery efforts made significant progresses since then. However, there are still many things that need to be done. We will hear more about it from two speakers today from Irides Tohoku University. Professor Shinichi Egawa, Disaster Medical Science Division, and Dr. Elizabeth Izumi, International Research Collaboration Office. They will share with us their experiences related to GEJT through their research and study. I believe that we could learn more about what the current recovery situation and challenges are, then how we could contribute to the ongoing recovery efforts. While you're listening to the presentations, please do not forget to send your questions using the Q&A function. After each presentation, we will have Q&A session to answer those questions directly to speakers. So now I'd like to introduce and welcome the first speaker, Professor Shinichi Egawa. Professor Egawa is a pancreatic surgeon and Professor International Cooperation for Disaster Medicine in the Irides Tohoku University. He participated in the headquarters of the Tohoku University Hospital in the 2011 GEJT. His major research field is about medical needs in disaster medicine, hospital businesses continuity plan, health workforce development, computer simulation of disaster medicine, and development of healthy and resilient community against disaster. He published 190 and more English articles and has been served as executive editor for disaster medicine in Tohoku Journal of Experimental Medicine and the advisory working group for the project for strengthening the ASEAN regional capacity on disaster health management. So floor is yours, Professor Egawa.
Thank you, Professor Izumi. And this is my great pleasure to be here to present you about the medical responses in disaster. So let me share the slides. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
That's great. And today's my topic is the multi-hazard resilience in the aging era. So as you already know, there are three factors consisting the disaster risk: the vulnerability and capacity and hazards. And the consequence of these three factors makes the disaster. And usually we hear frequently the word natural disaster, but there is no natural disaster. Actually, they are natural hazards: the earthquake, tsunami, and typhoon. And this is a mark for the radiation. And this is a SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is causing the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is an Ebola virus. So these are called hazards. And hazards itself is not a disaster. So hazards attacks a community with the vulnerability and capacity. The consequence is the disaster. So the disaster risk is calculated like this: the hazard and its exposure with the vulnerability. These are the upper side, and the capacity is the lower side. So to reduce the disaster risk, reduce the upper side, the hazard or hazard exposure and vulnerability, and increase the capacity so that the risk is becoming much smaller. So the disaster risk reduction has a framework that know your risk and reduce your risk and be prepared to act. So there are many hazards. So the vector-borne diseases or waterborne diseases, these are one of the natural hazards, which is a biological hazard. And there are extraterrestrial, or we have the geophysical hazards and hydrometeorological hazards, and human-induced hazards, the technological hazard and societal hazard, and terrorism and war is also a hazard, man-made hazard. And environmental hazard includes the climate change itself, or the sea level rise, or desertification. So there are so many hazards, and it is impossible to plan for these individual hazards. All hazards approach, and APRU, this is great that APRU has a multi-hazard program, so the all hazard approach and disaster risk reduction is the practical way. And I want to tell you about the CBRE hazards. And the sea burn, this is called sea burn, sometimes sea burn hazards or sea burn disaster. So the C, it stands for the chemical. And there was a chemical attack in the Tokyo subway in 1995 when the Great Hanshin-Awaji earthquake occurred, but actually the sarin attack was a chemical disaster in Tokyo. And the B stands for the biological, including the Ebola virus outbreak and the COVID-19 pandemic. And radiological and nuclear hazards includes one of the example is Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. And E stands for the explosion, accident, terror or conflict and war. So that I already told you that the risk reduction can be considered like this using this formula. So how can we reduce the risk of the COVID-19 pandemic? So that make the smaller hazard and exposure, that is the wearing the masks, physical distancing, and the avoid 3 closed spaces, crowded spaces, and close contact settings. And this make the vulnerability smaller, so that less comorbidity, meaning that make your body healthier and protect vulnerable population. So that protect the welfare facility and the larger capacity. The capacity of the society includes the government leadership, advocacy, and communication capability. And individual coping capacity is also important. Altruism is thinking that other person's position, or medical service coordination is a coping capacity. So making these hazard and exposure smaller and vulnerability smaller and capacity larger makes the risk of the pandemic smaller. The reason why I add the aging era in my title is that we are facing the aging society. And this is one of the characteristics. I don't say it's vulnerability. I think it's a characteristics or property of our society. So there is a Help Age International, so that they saying that Charter 4 for older people in disaster risk reduction. There are 3 principles in need. Older people have specific requirements which must be understood and responded to within all DRR activities. DRR is a disaster risk reduction. And invisible, older people's vulnerabilities and capacities are often overlooked. The collection of data on people's age and sex is essential to ensure older people and other people at risk are visible and supported in DRR, and invaluable. The older people have years of knowledge, skills, and wisdom, which are invaluable assets in DRR and must be acknowledged, valued, and engaged by supporting older people to participate in DRR. There are, this table is a minimum standards in DRR for older people, and easy to win, good practice or best practice. And one of the example is an evacuation and rest centers are age responsive with off-floor seating, wheelchair accessible facilities, handrails, and privacy for men and women. And one of the good example of a good practice is emergency personnel in health, search and rescue, management, coordination, protection, and livelihoods has been trained in working with older people and addressing their specific needs and strengths in emergencies. And one of the example of a best practice is older people have access to affordable disaster insurance and risk transfer mechanisms. So thinking that older people are thinking of ourselves. And this is a structure of Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. Sendai Framework has 4 priorities. The priority 1 is understand your disaster risk. The 2 is govern your disaster risk. And 3 is invest in disaster risk reduction. And the priority 4 is enhance preparedness for effective response and build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And by inputting these implementation, the national and local strategies, international cooperation, and multi-hazard early warning system to reduce the mortality and affected people and direct economic loss and infrastructure, especially the critical infrastructure for the society, including the health facilities and educational facilities, meaning hospitals and schools. And this curve indicates the resilience. So when the resilient is achieved, a society has less damage by a disaster and quicker recovery by the disaster. So this is possible by the building back better and the disaster risk reduction. So when the second disaster attacks, the damage is less and the recovery could be quicker. But if it fails, the damage should be larger and slower. So this is a very important idea. And how we can make the stakeholders to get involved in the disaster risk reduction. Sendai Framework states that women, children, and young persons and people with disabilities, and poor people, migrants, and indigenous people, volunteers, and the community of the practitioners, and older persons. So we are multi-cluster society and multi-layer society. And I want to explain you about the change of health risks in disaster. In 1995, January 2017, and the Kobe or Osaka area was attacked by a strong earthquake, magnitude 7.3. This is called Great Hanshin-Awaji earthquake. At that time, the collapsed buildings killed the people. The Japanese government made the building code amended, and the Japan Association for Disaster Medicine was established. And when I don't have to show this video, but this is a video of Great East Japan earthquake. Professor Imamura, our director, created this video. So about like 30 minutes or 40 minutes later, after the earthquake, the tsunami attacked the coastal area. And at that time, when we compare the human damage of 2 disasters, the Great Hanshin-Awaji earthquake in 1995, magnitude 7.3, 6,000 people were killed, but 43,000 people got injured. And magnitude 9.0, the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake is 350 times stronger energy, but the number of deaths was mostly by the tsunami, but the number of injured was greatly decreased to 6,000 people. So how it was achieved? This is a victory of the disaster risk reduction of the buildings and the structures and probably the disaster medical system. The less injuries, but different medical needs lasted longer, and disruption of traffic and communication made the health sector paralyzed, and complicated radiological disaster in Fukushima, and mental health of affected people was devastated, and health facilities were also destroyed by the disaster. And on the other hand, the education of disaster medicine was not enough or generalized in the health professionals. And this is a very typical type of death after disaster. It is called disaster-related death. So Japanese government officially recognized this disaster-related deaths because of the compensation for the victims. So in Fukushima Prefecture, even after 1 year, 2 years after the disaster, the people kept dying because of the general fatigue or mental health problems. And more than 90% are over 70s, and the gender was equal. 60% of them had some comorbidity. So this is the official statistics of the Japanese government. On this time point, 1,200 people, the cause of death was physical and mental expiration during the evacuation centers. And they died at hospitals and healthcare facilities and homes and evacuation shelters. So our laboratory created the disaster medical records that was recorded in the evacuation centers by the external supporting medical teams. So that this is not a medical record in the hospital. So the time trend of the first visit day and first day diagnosis is like this. So there was a peak at day 10. So the peak would come between the 1 week and the second week. The most frequent cause of the disease is an infectious respiratory disease that is a common cold, but many of them have hypertension and metabolic diseases. So you can see the trend of the chronic diseases is a most major cause of the disease or medical needs. And the sleep deprivation or sleep disturbance is also an important cause. So the biggest medical needs was non-communicable disease. Non-communicable disease is a chronic disease that is not the infectious disease. The second medical needs was infectious disease. And the third was mental health issue. And the trauma means the minor injury when clearing the rubbles. And the age and sex distribution of these disease categories were this is a background population before the disaster. The non-communicable disease has a very similar type of the population pyramid. And the infectious disease affected all the age of the people. However, mental health issues were more frequent in the middle age or older age groups. And the trauma was more frequently in men. And most of them, this mental health issue was sleep disturbance in middle-aged or old-age women. So the Japanese medical assistance team created many other teams, the expertise teams, including this Japanese rehabilitation assistance team called GEJET. And so this is a 2016 Kumamoto earthquake. This Japanese disaster rehabilitation team visited the evacuation center and joined the health cluster meeting at the headquarters, and they set the slope and handrails for the disabled people or older people, and they provided temporary supporting device, and they overwatched this old woman stepping up her entrance. So the medical needs and public health needs and capacity can be illustrated like this. So there, in the aging society, the medical needs of the non-communicable disease exist even before the disaster. So immediately after the disaster, the injuries can be a cause, but after the days or weeks, the non-communicable disease is the biggest cause of the medical needs. And when infectious disease like COVID-19 pandemic happens, the medical needs of these infectious disease will have a big portion. But the local health providers cannot provide the medical service. So the self-help is a first aid and the external relief aid is the next one. So how we should be prepared is a question. So when the COVID-19 happens, the infectious disease medical needs exist before something happens. So we have to another strategy to cope with this medical needs. This is I'm sorry. So this is a age-related mortality and morbidity of the COVID-19. So when vaccination definitely prevents the older people to get severe disease, but even so, the 80s and 90s people will suffer the severity of the disease. So that before Great East Japan earthquake, we had this disaster medical system, including the disaster-based hospital, DMAT, and wide area transportation system, with supported by the emergency medical information system. But after the Great East Japan earthquake, we implemented this disaster medical coordinator and the psychiatric assistance team and DHEAT, JRAT, and mother and child health liaison, hemodialysis liaison, and standardized disaster medical report system. So I and other colleagues in our institute wrote this chapter in the WHO guidance for the research in the health EDRM. The health EDRM is a health emergency and disaster risk management. Knowing that this Tohoku area was attacked periodically by the earthquakes and tsunamis, we should be prepared. And when we look over the past 400 years, the tsunami occurred everywhere. So we cannot estimate our disaster risk only by the memories. We have to understand the historical consequences of the disasters. And the Japanese implementation of the Disaster Countermeasure Basic Act decreased the number of deaths in the climate-related disasters. However, something that a great Hanshin Awaji earthquake or Great East Japan earthquake will happen. So from liability to asset, this is a change of population pyramid in 1950 to 2010. And so we are facing the aging of the society, but this is not only in Japan, the Philippines, Nepal, and US, and Indonesia, and Ghana. They will become this bell-shaped population pyramid in 2050. So this is an informed risk index. I don't have time to explain, but when we compare the life expectancy of the country and the informed risk, the life expectancy negatively correlates with the informed risk index. And this correlates very well more with the vulnerability and lack of coping capacity risks, meaning that we have Japan, the red circle is a point of Japan. So Japan has high risk of hazard and exposure, but Japan has very low vulnerability and very low lack of coping capacity. So when we compare the type of hazard and life expectancy, the earthquake, tsunami, or tropical cyclone positively correlates with the life expectancy. But the drought and flood, it will be negatively correlate with the life expectancy. So we can investigate why this happens. And this is a health-related categories of risk and life expectancy. And Japan has very low risk of these socioeconomic vulnerability, children under 5, mortality or malnutrition, and very low in the lack of access. So this is a negative way of saying, so Japan has good access to healthcare. So this is a take-home message, and make it possible to include older people as a stakeholder in disaster risk reduction with all hazard approach. Community with high life expectancy has low disaster risk. But a high hazard and exposure risk country like Japan can reduce total disaster risk by decreasing the vulnerability and lack of coping capacity with improved health-related indicators and building back better from prior disasters. So always make research and make the research result and implement it into the society. And improving health indicators is an effective and important strategy of disaster risk reduction, making a healthy society resilient against disaster. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Egawa, for your presentation. Very, very informative, I think, and also you should pick up a very important issues in the future disaster risk management. So we received a couple of questions, and first one is, under the COVID-19 situation, what should we do if earthquake happen and we must be evacuated? We must evacuate in place that make a crowded situation. So at the same time, we have to anticipate COVID transmission. So how should we deal with this kind of situation?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very frequent question in this pandemic time. But of course, evacuate from when the earthquake happens. And evacuation is the only way to survive the tsunami. So that if the tsunami is expected, just evacuate. And but don't forget you're wearing your masks and bringing your usual drugs, because the evacuation life will last for a longer time. So don't forget to bring your usual medicine, or don't forget to bring your medical record, meaning that I have a hypertension, I have diabetes. So be prepared to be able to explain it to the external medical relief team. So that will help you to survive the evacuation life. So that another problem is you can stay your home and make your house resilient to the disaster, like earthquake, so that if your house is strong enough, you can survive. But if you are living in a very vulnerable house, like a brick-made house in an earthquake frequent area, your house will not protect you. So that is a risk reduction. So it will take a time and money, but investment is a very important priority for the disaster risk reduction. So it will cost much effectively to spend the money for the disaster risk reduction than spending money for the response itself.
Thank you, Professor Egawa. I think this COVID-19 situation showed us more difficulties in disaster risk reduction, because it includes pandemic and also the natural hazards. Yes. And also you mentioned in the future, we have to think about CBRE as well. So in your perspective, how should we strengthen our disaster risk reduction strategies in the future, including all different types of hazards?
So one of another idea of the evacuation center is we have been repeating the very similar evacuation center situation that is crowded and not sanitized and very poor facility many times during this history. But we should change it with using the partitions and cardboard beds, or kind of like separating each evacuees social distance, or making the capacity of the evacuation centers are much bigger. That is one of the strategy. And what was your question?
Oh, sorry. I mean, for the future disaster risk reduction strategies, and now I think we are focusing more rather natural hazards. but you mentioned CBRE,
Yeah.
how we can strengthen more diverse disaster and hazards.
So thank you very much. So this is a very common idea of the SDGs and the climate change adaptation and the Sendai Framework. So all of these international agreement was adopted in 2015, and they are interrelated. So the development without the disaster risk risk-informed development. I mean, the development should be informed the disaster risk reduction. And the climate change will also make the type of hazards stronger. So that climate change will make the climate hazard stronger and more frequent. So they are interrelated. And the war or terror crime are related with a peacekeeping operation. That is included in the Sustainable Development Goals. So that we should be aware that how we are in the sustainable environment, sustainable society in this very complicated world. So every activity of your daily life will make the next day's world change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Egawa. We have more questions to you. So probably due to the limitation of the time, I will ask you one more question. Yeah. Quantitative data collection is necessary to reduce health effects and mortality, but often difficult during disasters. How do you think it would be best to establish a system for data accumulation on health during disasters in the future?
Yes, I didn't show but I showed the improvement after the Great Ishikana earthquake. There are many expert teams, and one of the improvement is development of the J-Speed system. J-Speed system is a daily surveillance system of the medical needs, health needs of the people. So J-Speed is a daily reporting system, so the external medical teams assess the health condition of the evacuees and daily report. They use smartphones and other PCs to report it to the headquarters. So the headquarters can make the decision based on the evidence of what kind of medical needs is happening right now. So this is one of the cutting edge technology of Japanese medical system.
Thank you for the information, Dr. Egawa. And unfortunately, we lack of time. So if you have time, and we received some of the questions on the Q&A, so I really appreciate if you can type or you can answer this question if you have time and possible. And I will also send you the questions we received later on. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Egawa, and it's very, very insightful presentation. So now I'd like to introduce and welcome the next speaker, my dear colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Izumi. She is an associate professor at the Tohoku University. And with the theme of people-centered housing recovery, her research interests are community-based housing recovery and provision methods of transitional and permanent housing within the reconstruction processes, including policy, process, and housing form that support successful life recovery for disaster-affected people. Past and current research focuses on the experiences of people affected by disaster and the roles of government and NGOs in the processes of housing reconstruction and resettlement after disasters in the USA, Indonesia, Philippines, and Japan. So thank you, Elise, for your participation today, and the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Izumi, and it's really my pleasure to be here and also to be following up after a great presentation from Dr. Egawa. Let's see if I can share my screen, and can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great. So thank you for also the kind introduction, and my background is in architecture. So my field is my focus is on housing reconstruction. So I want to talk a little bit about those issues. So a little bit of a longer term time scale than some of the issues that were introduced by Professor Egawa recently. So Just as a reminder that the 3/11 disaster was a complex disaster that's not only it was massive in size, but spread across a vast area and included different disasters within one event, kind of cascading event. And the devastation was massive, as you know already, but it really affected a huge coastal area along all of the northeast region of Japan and caused massive devastation to so many communities in that region. And along with the massive loss of life and property damage, and there's a significant displacement, which continues even today. Maybe the data from now March is maybe more like 33,000 people who are still officially displaced or living in some kind of interim or temporary housing situation. So we already had a great explanation about the issues of aging from Professor Egawa. So I'm really happy. I think there's really a lot of overlap in terms of how we think about society from a health and wellness perspective, and also a community and housing recovery perspective. So the only thing I would add is just that the composition of society and the high rate of aging in the population also has impacts for recovery, thinking about the difficulty that folks face moving to new locations and changing their community and being displaced from familiar areas, and also longer term implications for society, for the future sustainability of communities. And then not only that, but the areas, specifically the areas that were affected in 2011 by the tsunami and nuclear disaster, were a lot of smaller communities where this aging was already happening faster than in other parts of Japan. And along with that, there was a depopulation as younger people are moving away from small coastal communities to inland areas for jobs or to just move to a bigger city. And so, as we see in disasters and response and recovery phases, whatever issues were there before are kind of magnified and amplified by the disaster. So in this case, the disaster and tsunami and recovery process also sped up these processes. So depopulation and aging kind of started to happen faster than it would have otherwise. So in terms of the geographical context, the area that was affected in 2011 includes the Rias coast, which is like the fjords in Norway. So lots of little jagged coastal areas, a lot of little small communities dotting that area. And then to the south, where we are here in Sendai, is the Sendai Plain, which is a vast flat area with no barrier for not a lot of natural topography to block the tsunami. So these were issues, these contexts affected the recovery and reconstruction planning and implementation of related programs. So just a couple images of the devastation that's caused by a tsunami that really wipes away all parts of people's lives and communities that were there before. And actually, we have sadly so much experience in Japan with disasters of all different kinds, but including also tsunamis that happened specifically in the northern part of the same region that was affected in 2011. There was a historically large tsunamis in 1896 and again in 1933. And then again, the 1960 earthquake in Chile caused also a tsunami in this area. So there is a repeated experience actually about once a generation of a massive tsunami disaster. And because of that, actually, we have even in the past relocation projects that happened after those historic disasters. So after these tsunamis, as shown in the diagrams, there were either whole communities or parts of communities that were rebuilt in higher ground or moved from the low ground to a safer area in higher ground. However, you can also see on the right side, there were also examples where after that happened, over time, people move back and live again in the lowland area because it's very convenient, land is available, close to fishing, etc. So this is a part of a cyclical history in this region. And we can see some examples, this is an area where the community had moved to higher ground after a past disaster, but then over time, next generations had rebuilt in the lower area. And you can see really what we can call a heaven and hell line, because where the houses survived above that, they were safe, but all the houses in the lower areas were completely destroyed. We also have examples of places where people had moved away from residential areas and low-lying in places, and they were able to be preserved as a non-residential uses, so farming or growing rice. And this is an example where that was the case in 2011, that no one had moved back into the area, and so no one lost their life there. So after the tsunami, there was a big shift in thinking about how to protect lives and communities. And from before, it had really strong reliance on physical modifications or infrastructure to defend against any kind of risk. So measure the risk, figure out how high the tsunami could be, and build a wall that's a little bit higher than that, and you will be fine. But that way of thinking was no longer the case, because in 2011, the tsunami exceeded kind of the planned calculated heights. And so the new thinking that came about is now thinking about different categories. A level 1 tsunami is a kind of one that we might experience again in 30 or 40 years. And for a level 1 tsunami, of course, Japan still relies on physical infrastructure and protective structures. But then along with that, we now think about another kind of tsunami, a level 2 tsunami, a massive tsunami similar to the one that we experienced in 2011. And in that case, the design for the physical protection is the tsunami is expected to go over that, but then so the water will come in beyond the wall or the seawall, but then the planning relies on multiple defenses. So a combination of raised forests or multiple raised highways in the case of Sendai, or roads, and also the relocation and land use planning to move settlements and residential areas further away, and also integrate with evacuation planning and evacuation knowledge. And so I'm not going to talk about all of these things because we definitely don't have time, but my point is just that not only does Japan have a lot of experience, sadly, with devastating disasters, and then also Japan has experience with reconstruction, and therefore there is already a well-established system of precedents and examples to draw from in terms of reconstruction projects. And so after the Great East Japan earthquake, in some ways there were new structures created to support the implementation of reconstruction programs and projects, but in many ways they were drawing on and reusing or repackaging existing methods and strategies for reconstruction. And so this is just an example from one town here in our prefecture, Miyagi Prefecture, several hours away from Sendai by car, in Minami Sanriku town. So the photo above is what the town looked like before the tsunami, you see it from the air, and then in the photo on the bottom and the images on the right, you can see the devastation that happened in 2011. So basically all of the low-lying area was devastated by the tsunami, and the green areas that survived are the hills or the mountainous areas. And so, and this is kind of an example of a kind of typical land use planning process or land use planning result dealing with that situation, where the planned uses after the tsunami as part of the recovery and reconstruction is locating the residential areas away from the coast, the residential areas in higher land areas. And the yellow areas on the map are residential areas. So also we saw a separation of uses. So commercial facilities and shopping facilities and businesses may be allowed to be rebuilt in the coastal areas or low-lying areas, but the residential and housing areas are relocated further up and further inland. And this is a very crude and simple diagram, but shows basically what happened in most places, where is either that the mountains were cut into the mountains or cut off, and new residential areas were developed as part of the reconstruction programs, or if there was no mountain, it was piled up to make higher areas, and then new residential areas were placed there. And Japan has a strong programs for relocating housing, which includes both buying out the properties that were damaged or devastated in the disaster, and providing the new residential land in a higher land area, which is a little bit well, at least quite different from the United States, but kind of Japan's typical community-based relocation, recovering support strategy. So these kind of relocation programs included massive modifications of the landscape, along with massive infrastructure projects to result in new communities that in many cases look very different from what was there before. And of course, took a massive amount of time, energy, money, all of it. And so this is kind of an example of the lots that were provided for residents who wanted to rebuild on their own. Depending on the town, they could either rent or buy the land and then rebuild on the higher land area lots. And then along the way, Japan also has a very established process of supporting the different phases of recovery. Professor Egawa talked a bit about the evacuation phase, but then following that, we have the temporary housing phase. So while people are waiting for permanent housing to be ready or to be completed, to be rebuilt, they're supported by temporary housing that's provided by the Japanese government. I won't talk about the details, but I'm happy to answer any questions or expand if people are interested in that. And so after the temporary housing phase, in the permanent housing phase, people either rebuild on their own. And this is an example of one of the communities where the town's recovery project created new residential areas, like a new subdivision, and then residents could rebuild their own houses there. And this is kind of a typical pattern of suburban housing development that you would see anywhere in Japan in terms of the style and the arrangement and the housing itself. Another aspect, a big part of Japan's support for disaster survivors in terms of housing reconstruction is the provision of what's called disaster recovery public housing. And so like all public housing in Japan, it is income sensitive, government sponsored rental housing. And in this case, which I think is a little bit unique compared to other countries, after this disaster, because of so many coastal areas and rural communities, there were not only were there apartment buildings and multifamily housing, public housing provided, there's also a lot of single family detached public housing, which is a bit of a difference than in other countries, I believe. And so sometimes this was provided together in the highland areas with the private housing. So I won't try not to get into too many details. I'm a housing nerd, but maybe not everyone is. But the Japanese, the recovery after 2011 included more than 30,000 units of disaster recovery public housing, either in multifamily apartment style buildings or also single family detached buildings. And there were 18,000 residential lots as part of relocation projects all along the coastal area in the affected municipalities. So I just want to talk just a little bit about Fukushima and the issues and challenges for post disaster housing recovery for the nuclear disaster affected communities and residents. And also, I'm really happy and lucky that Professor Egawa already mentioned some of these issues. So he already mentioned to you the indirect death situation or phenomenon that we unfortunately know well in Japan. So along with the direct deaths from the disaster and missing people whose bodies were never found, we have this indirect death, or we call in Japanese kannenshi, which are people who passed away not directly from the impact of the disaster, but as a result of some impact of the evacuation process or some worsening of a medical condition or injury, or also from the mental stress compounding those physical evacuation and also the mental aspect of the evacuation and difficulties in that phase. And so as you can see, actually in Fukushima from early on, the number of people who died were actually larger for those who died from and these are the numbers that are officially recognized as an indirect death. So you can get compensation, the families can get compensation from the government as if they're the bereaved families of someone who's designated as an indirect death. And so in Fukushima, one of the characteristics is that there are actually more people who died later, not from the impact of the disaster itself, because of the nature of the nuclear accident. And the other characteristic that's important to notice is that there were also many more people who evacuated outside of their home prefecture in Fukushima. So yeah, so I don't want to get too much into the data, but again, those are kind of the main points that I want to make, that Fukushima has more complicated additional issues, especially with the indirect deaths, and then especially because of so many folks who are displaced away from their hometown, away even outside of their prefecture, across Japan, or even outside of Japan. And they make up a large number of the people who are still evacuated now. So just, I know I don't have too much time, but just to go over a couple points about the nuclear accident and meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. This shows the location of where that power plant is. Fukushima is the further south prefecture from us here in Sendai and Miyagi prefecture. And the right is an example of the map, the zones that were designated for many years, even up to today, that show the different categories of areas based on how much contamination they have and whether people are able to live there or return there and when. So very simply, in the time after the disaster, after the meltdown occurred and there was radioactive materials that were dispersed in the air based on the direction of wind that was happening at that time, the earlier disbursement, you can see on the left, this is the image from the a system called SPEEDY, which is a monitoring system that monitors where the radioactive materials are. This information actually wasn't shared with people who needed it in a timely way. So actually people evacuated because evacuation zones were established based on distance. So people were told to evacuate, 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers, but many people actually evacuated into the path of the radioactive materials. And then, so as I said, this map shows the different areas, different levels of zones that were established later. And more recently, most of those zones have now been lifted to allow people to come back, with only a smaller percent in the still difficult to return zone, the pink area where people aren't able to live, aren't allowed to live. However, it's very complicated, and just because a zone area is open, that doesn't mean that people want to come back or are coming back. So there's only a very small number of population of people who are returning to those places. On the other hand, there are also people who do want to come back, and especially for elderly residents, any kind of perceived risks is maybe minimal that they would see within their lifetime. So there's a lot of issues in terms of risk communication and what's safe and who decides what's safe and how people feel themselves. And there are a lot of this. It's a challenge because for many reasons, but also because Japanese reconstruction policy is based on recovery within one municipality. So the relocation, all those moving to highland areas are usually within the same town. And so when the problem exceeds the scale of the municipality, it's really difficult to address, and different people want different things, and it's hard to really support effectively all the communities and all the residents and everyone's needs. And yeah, so the logic of disaster recovery, we have all these precedents, we have all these programs and examples to draw from, but they're based on the idea that you're able to come back and rebuild in the same place. And long-term displacement from the nuclear disaster across a wide area over an uncertain time period is not really able to be addressed by these precedent programs. So yeah, again, I think it's quite complicated. I'm happy to take more detailed questions if they are coming up. So after 10 years overall, and this is thinking about both the tsunami affected areas and the nuclear impacted areas. So the planning for town reconstruction is complete, basically. In Fukushima, there's still ongoing redevelopment planning, but in general, the municipalities who did the planning work, that's done. New roads are built, new highways, new railroad tracks, or new transportation systems, and a lot of seawalls, a lot of concrete physical infrastructure are mostly built. There's also continuing construction that's going on now, but basically those are nearing or complete. And there's also new construction of shopping centers and commercial areas and buildings, and new housing areas have been created. People have moved into the new housing in most cases. But there are also people who moved away, who didn't want to wait for the process, and really a big changes in terms of communities that don't really resemble what was there before. So there are also, along with that, there are also long-term challenges for the sustainability of the affected communities and the rebuilt communities. What are they going to look like in 10 years or 20 years? A lot of new housing areas built high on the mountains with only housing and only elderly residents. And along with depopulation and aging, there are also economic issues, and COVID made that even more difficult, like places that were really relying on tourism and sharing their delicious food and delicious food and, you know, beautiful views and great people, and relying on tourists and visitors to come. Really, like, finally after 10 years they rebuilt their communities, and then COVID hit, so they took another hit in terms of economic damage. So I think there are open issues also for how to rebuild these communities and do these necessary placemaking in areas that are now empty as a result of the disaster and also a result of the reconstruction. And this is an example from 2 days ago in the Ogatsu area of Ishinomaki City, building all of these beautiful, massive concrete structures to protect areas actually where no people are living in the low-lying areas, but the walls are there. And then this is also one community-led project, local residents who got together to do to create a rose garden. And the top left is from 2 days ago, but the bottom photos are from a different season when it's more beautiful in the summertime. But this is an example where the folks involved in this project just tried to do something little by little, and now actually they've gotten it approved or incorporated into the city's plan for the reuse of that area. So I just want to leave you with the final point that recovery is long-term, and what our recovery issues are actually become sustainable community issues. I mean, you can also think about before the disaster, what are social vulnerability issues become recovery challenges. Once we get into recovery, we transition into sustainable community issues. So we need more work and more effort is needed, but towards not recovery projects or recovery programs, but community building and placemaking. And there are already examples of people doing that. And we also need to, I think it's a great opportunity to connect to the history and the traditional memories of the place and documentation to connect with the future of the city. And I know in the second webinar series, my colleague, Dr. Julia Gerster, is going to be talking about that aspect. So I encourage you to join that as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz, for your presentation. And it was very nice to show us a lot of photos and progress especially in reconstruction and relocation as well. So you also mentioned some, the completion and achievement in terms of planning for town reconstruction. So what is the how to call the causes? I mean, they achieved quite a lot in terms of planning, and so how they made that kind of successful reconstruction and recovery, you think?
Well, I think the Japanese government does really support with a lot of funding for these programs, and so I think that's a big one. And this was kind of unprecedented that the national government funded 100% of development work that usually wouldn't be funded by the national government in these areas. So I think that's a big one. And to have these programs that provide housing and provide the kind of support that, you know, we can see the issues, but other places would be like, wow, that's really great. Like not every country provides this kind of level of support. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question completely, but.
Okay, thank you so much, Liz. Also, and you also highlighted very clearly the challenges. Still, there are so many challenges, and what we need to do in the next few, in the future. So, what would be the most important things for the future recovery in the second decade?
It's very difficult to say what is the most important thing, but maybe some of the things that kind of pop into my mind. First of all, I think economic issues are really key. So if people don't have work, if people aren't able to have a sustainable livelihood, it's very difficult to support the other community functions. So I think economic aspect is one, and then maybe the other one is really the non-physical aspect. So community building, people getting together and working together, and that kind of supporting those kind of activities from social welfare, but also placemaking and community building, and, you know, from education of kids, but also like networking of community, those kind of soft side activities, I guess.
All right, thank you so much, Liz, for your presentation. And we really need to work harder for the second decade of the recovery. And I hope we can work together in the future. Okay, thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you.
And also, as she highlighted, we have different types of issues in Fukushima, especially. So for that part, we really need, you know, the different expertise and also the different strategies. And that's for another, for sort of the areas we need further collaboration and cooperation from other parts of the world, I think. Okay, so that is all for today's session. And I'd like to express our sincere appreciation to Professor Egawa and Dr. Mali for their excellent presentations. Also, thank you to all the audience who joined us this session today. And I have to apologize, we were not able to answer to all the questions, but I hope the speakers can send some answers through Q&A. And I hope you learned about the recovery efforts from GEJET. And as Liz mentioned, we will have the second session on 25th of March, and we will have two speakers at the time, Professor Yuichi Ono and Dr. Yuria Gerstad from Illes Tohoku University, and we will learn more about GEJET and the current recovery situation. So please do not forget to register for that second session. And please be informed that the recording and the slides will be shared on the APRU website in the near future. And for organizing this webinar, my colleagues at APRU International Secretariat in Hong Kong and at IRIDIS always work very hard. So I thank you again for your significant support and contribution. So I look forward to meeting all of you again on March 25th. So have a great day and have a good night. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.